My name is Vivian Ashworth. I hold the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Setzarl. The probate courtroom was smaller than I expected. No jury box, no cameras yet. Just wood paneling the color of old coffee and a silence that pressed against my ears like altitude. My father sat at the front of the petitioner's table, spine straight, watch catching the light every time he checked it. My mother sat beside him in a charcoal suit, hands folded the way she used to fold them on the bench, back when she was the one making rulings instead of asking for one. My brother Preston sat one seat over, tapping his pen against a legal pad like he was keeping time to a song only he could hear. My attorney, Diane Okafor, leaned toward me. "You don't have to look at them." "I know," I said. I looked at them anyway. The judge, a woman named Harmon with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, cleared her throat and glanced at the petition in front of her. "This is a probate matter concerning the estate of Walter Ashworth. Counsel for the petitioners, you may proceed with your opening." Grant Holloway rose, buttoning his jacket with the unhurried confidence of a man who bills by the hour and enjoys every minute of it. "Your Honor, the petitioners, Richard and Eleanor Ashworth and Preston Ashworth, do not dispute the validity of Walter Ashworth's will. They dispute whether the respondent, Vivian Ashworth, has met its conditions. The will conditions a significant portion of the family trust on, and I quote, the grandchild who has served this country with honor, attaining a confirmed senior officer rank. We contend the respondent cannot substantiate that condition, and given the pattern of behavior we intend to show this court, we further request the appointment of a conservator over her share of the estate, pending a full accounting of her competency." I didn't gasp, but I heard it from somewhere behind me, a stranger in the gallery, someone who'd wandered in off a probate docket looking for something more interesting than a zoning dispute and found, apparently, a family war instead. Diane didn't flinch. She never did. "Your Honor, we'll reserve our opening for after petitioners present their case. The respondent is prepared to answer every question this court has." Judge Harmon nodded once. "Then let's begin." I studied my family while Holloway settled back into his chair. My father had aged in the 2 years since I'd last sat across a table from him. More gray at the temples, a new stiffness in the way he held his shoulders, as though the money he managed for other people had started finally to cost him something of his own. My mother still carried herself like she was on the bench, even seated in the gallery of someone else's courtroom, which I understood now was probably the only posture she knew how to occupy in a room like this. And Preston looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hearing. I noticed it before I understood what it meant. I would understand it fully by the second day. None of them looked at me directly. I found I didn't especially want them to, not yet. There would be time enough before this was over for all of us to look at each other and mean it. I didn't know yet that a man in dress greens was going to walk through those doors before this was over, that he would stop 3 feet from me and salute like the 8 years I'd spent silent had never happened at all. I didn't know that the truth I'd buried in Molly would surface in a Pennsylvania probate court of all places, dressed in ribbons I'd never been allowed to wear in public. I only knew that I was 38 years old, and for the second time in my life, I was going to have to decide whether the people who raised me deserved to know who I really was. The first time I was 19. The acceptance letter from Morton sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before I told them I wasn't going. I remember the cream envelope, the embossed seal, the particular way my mother had already started planning which of her friends to tell first. I remember my father's face when I finally said it, not shock, not anger, just a kind of recalibration, like he was doing math in his head and not liking the answer. "You got into Wharton," he said, as if I might not have noticed. "I know, and you want to enlist in the Army. I've already signed the paperwork, Dad." He set down his coffee cup very precisely, the way he set down everything, like each object in our house had a correct location and an incorrect one, and he alone could tell the difference. "People like us don't enlist, Vivian. We endow things. We sit on boards. Your grandfather built this family's name managing other people's money for 40 years so that none of his children or grandchildren would ever have to take orders from a 23-year-old sergeant with a GED. Grandpa Walter served," I said quietly. "Grandpa Walter came home and built something," my father said. "That's the part you're skipping." My mother didn't say anything for a long time. She had been a judge for 11 years by then, and she had a particular silence she used in the courtroom before handing down something unpleasant. She used it on me that morning. "This is not a decision you get to make alone at 19, she finally said. "I already made it." Preston, 17 and glued to his phone at the far end of the table, didn't even look up. So you're running off to play soldier because Dad wouldn't let you run the Q3 numbers last summer? That's not, I started and then stopped, because there was no version of that sentence that would land the way I needed it to in that kitchen. The only person who came to find me before I left was my grandfather. Walter Ashworth was 81 that spring, still sharp enough to beat me at chess 2 games out of 3. And he found me in the garage at 2 in the morning packing a duffel bag I'd bought myself because I didn't want to ask for money. He didn't say much. He never did. He just set something down on top of my folded shirts, an old field watch, scratched, the leather band worn soft, and said, "This kept time in a place that didn't care what time it was. It'll keep time for you too." Then he said the only sentence from that entire year that I carried with me for the next 2 decades. Honor doesn't need applause, Vivian. It just needs to be true when nobody's checking. He was the only one who wrote to me at basic training. My parents sent one email 5 years later after my name appeared in a small item about a logistics deployment. 2 lines, we saw the article. We hope this phase brings you the clarity you were looking for. It wasn't a phase. It was 14 years of my life and I built almost all of it without them in the room. What none of them knew, what I never told a single soul outside a very short list of people who were legally forbidden from repeating it, was what happened outside a town called Ansongo in 2018. I was a major then, 6 years in, attached to a joint task force running a multinational stabilization effort under a classification tier I still can't fully describe. Our convoy was moving a wounded local partner force commander to a secure medical point when we hit a coordinated ambush 11 kilometers from the nearest friendly position. Communications went dark in the first 90 seconds. Our senior officer on the ground, then Colonel Marcus Whitfield, took a round through the leg trying to pull a driver out of a burning vehicle and went down hard, unconscious, before I reached him. There was no time to request permission for what happened next. There was no chain of command intact enough to grant it. So I didn't ask. I remember the dust more than the noise, oddly, the way it hung in the headlights of the lead vehicle even after the gunfire had knocked most of the light out of the world. I remember kneeling beside Whitfield, checking for a pulse with hands that weren't shaking yet, and understanding with a clarity I've never quite been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there, that the next 90 seconds belonged entirely to me whether I wanted them or not. I got on the radio with a call sign that wasn't mine to use re-establish contact with our secondary extraction element, redirected suppressing fire to buy us the 90 seconds we needed. And I carried Colonel Whitfield 200 meters on a fractured leg, his not mine, while directing a medevac that got every single person in that convoy out alive. I don't remember deciding to do any of it in the way you decide what to order at a restaurant. It was closer to remembering a language I hadn't realized I already spoke fluently. Afterward, in the cold hour before the extraction helicopter finally reached us, I sat with my back against a vehicle that no longer had all its windows and understood that I had just crossed a line that would define the rest of my career in ways I couldn't yet see, and that almost none of it would ever be visible to another living soul outside that convoy. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, standard form 312, the real one, the kind that follows you the rest of your life, 3 days later in a windowless room at a forward operating base. And I have never once regretted it. We survived. Every name that walked into that ambush walked out of it. That was the whole of what I needed. I was promoted below the zone to lieutenant colonel 18 months later, ahead of my peer group but not ahead of a single required rank. I'd made captain, then major, on schedule, the way the Army actually works. The promotion recommendation Whitfield wrote from a hospital bed in Landstuhl became part of a personnel file that almost nobody would ever be cleared to read. My own family never heard a word of it because there was no version of the story I was legally or morally permitted to tell them. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with surviving something extraordinary and then going home to people who only know you filed for extended leave that year. I remember landing at Dulles 11 days after the ambush, my leg bruised where I'd braced Whitfield's weight, and calling my mother from the terminal out of some old, stubborn hope that this might be the year she asked a real question. She asked whether I'd lost weight. I told her I had and left it there, because there was no sentence I could construct that would satisfy the security review and still tell her anything true. I didn't think it mattered that they didn't know. I thought the not knowing was the price of the job, and I'd made my peace with the bill a long time ago. I was wrong about how long that peace would hold. My grandfather died on a Tuesday in March, in his sleep, in the house where he'd taught me chess. I flew home on emergency leave and stood at the back of the funeral in my army blues because it was the only thing in my closet that felt honest. 3 weeks later, the family attorney read the will. Walter had left the bulk of the Ashworth family trust, the holding company, the real estate, 4 generations of careful, unglamorous wealth, divided among his children and grandchildren, with one unusual clause attached to the largest single share. It would pass the document, read, "To the grandchild who has served this country with honor, attaining a confirmed senior officer rank in the armed forces of the United States," as recognition of the values this family was built upon before it was built upon anything else. There was only one grandchild who had served. Preston had gone straight into the family trust management office at 22 and never left it. I found out later, much later, in a moment I'll get to, that my grandfather had known far more about my career than I ever told him. He had a network of his own from his time in Korea, old friends who'd stayed in touch with the kind of institutional memory that outlives official records. He knew, in the general shape a civilian is allowed to know, that something significant had happened to me overseas. He wrote that clause on purpose. He wrote it, I would come to understand, as a shield, not a test. But Preston was $300,000 into a series of trust-adjacent investments that had gone badly wrong, quietly enough that my parents hadn't fully grasped how badly. And the largest share of the estate had just been handed to the one sibling who couldn't produce a single public document proving what she'd become. I want to be clear that I don't think my parents sat down and calculated this cynically from day one. I think, and this is the generous version, the one I choose to believe on my better days, that my mother's discomfort with not understanding my life curdled into something she could dress up as concern. I think my father's need for the story to make sense to people at his club mattered more to him than he'd ever admit. And I think Preston needed the money, and needed it in a way that made every other explanation convenient. 6 weeks after the will was read, I was served. The petition didn't accuse me of a crime. My mother, 30 years a judge, was too precise a lawyer's wife for that. It accused me of failing to substantiate the will's condition, and it asked the probate court to do 2 things: strike my share of the estate for non-compliance, and appoint a conservator over my remaining assets, pending what the filing called a full evaluation of the respondent's competency and the veracity of her claimed military record. I read it standing in my kitchen in Fort Belvoir, and then I sat down on the floor, because my legs asked me to before my mind caught up. Diane Okafor had been a JJ officer for 11 years before she went into private probate and estate litigation, which is precisely why I'd hired her the day I got the notice. She read the filing twice before she said anything. "They can't touch your rank," she finally said. "Nobody can litigate whether the Army actually commissioned you. That's not a fact. A civil court adjudicates. The Army already adjudicated it the day you were promoted." "Then why does this feel like a trial?" "Because they're not suing you for stolen valor, Vivian. That's a federal statute, and it belongs to the Department of Justice, not your parents. What they're actually litigating is much narrower: whether you can meet the burden of proof in this proceeding, on this record, for this specific trust condition. It's a probate fight dressed up to look like a referendum on your entire life. That's a real distinction, and it's the one we're going to hold on to." "Can we win it without opening the file?" Diane was quiet for a moment. "There's a path. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records can issue what's called a limited scope verification confirmation of rank and dates of service without disclosing operational content. It wouldn't touch anything classified. It would just say, this officer holds this rank as of this date, full stop. It'll still put my name in a public docket next to a request that references Molly, even if the docket doesn't say the word. It might. I thought about the 200 meters. I thought about the 11 names that walked out of that ambush, because nobody outside a locked room ever learned exactly how. "Not yet," I said. "Let's see how much rope they give themselves first." She studied me for a long moment, the way she did when she was deciding whether to argue with a client or trust one. "Then we fight it the hard way," she said. "Understand, without that verification, you're going to look, on paper, like you're asking this court to take your word for your entire adult life." I almost smiled. "Almost. Let them underestimate that word," I said. "It's held up under worse scrutiny than a probate judge." Diane spent the next 2 weeks building what she called the narrow case, a strategy built entirely around keeping the proceeding inside its actual jurisdiction. The moment Holloway tries to turn this into a referendum on whether you're a liar, she told me over coffee in her office, legal pads spread across the table between us. I'm going to keep pulling him back to the only question this court can actually decide. Did you meet the condition of a testamentary trust? That's it. That's the whole case, legally. Everything else is theater, and theater doesn't carry the burden of proof. They're not going to let it stay narrow. No, she agreed. They're going to make it about you. Your discipline, your secrecy, your fitness to manage money, maybe even your fitness to manage yourself. I need you to understand something before we walk into that courtroom. None of that is actually about the will. It's about making a jury of one very tired judge uncomfortable enough with ambiguity that she rules against you just to make the discomfort stop. Judges are human. Uncertainty makes people reach for the safer feeling answer, even when the safer feeling answer isn't the correct one. So how do we fight discomfort with a hand this restricted? Diane tapped her pen against the table once. We don't fight it with documents we don't have. We fight it with precision. Every time they hand the court a feeling, we hand the court a fact, however small. And we let your own testimony do something. Documents can't. We let the court watch what discipline actually looks like, in real time, under pressure, from someone who's had a great deal of practice not breaking. I sat with that for a long moment. You make it sound like the hearing itself is the evidence. In a case built on absence, she said, sometimes it has to be. 3 days before the first substantive hearing, Preston sat for an interview on a small regional finance podcast that normally covered municipal bond rates. I only know because Diane sent me the clip with a single line, "You should hear this before opposing counsel plays it for you." Vivian's always needed to be the exceptional one, Preston said. Easy, almost fond, the way you'd describe a childhood habit. Growing up, if I made honor roll, she had to make honor roll and captain something. It's not that I think she's lying, exactly. I think she's built an identity around being unreachable, around nobody being able to check her story, and I think that's worth the court asking some questions about. I listened to it once, then I turned my phone face down on the table and didn't pick it up again that night. It got more precise after that. Grant Holloway specialized, Diane told me, in what she called reputation-adjacent litigation. Cases where the legal ask was narrow but the public framing did most of the actual work. In a pre-trial statement to a local reporter who'd caught wind of the filing, he said, "The family isn't disputing that Vivian Ashworth served her country. They're asking a probate court to require the same basic verification any employer would ask of any job candidate, and asking why she's fought so hard to avoid providing it." That line was clever. It was also, Diane pointed out, mostly true, which is what made it dangerous. My mother gave a single quote of her own, and it was the one that actually hurt. "We love our daughter," she told the reporter. "We're worried about her. There's a difference between being proud of someone and being afraid of what you don't understand about them." I read that sentence 4 times. I understood, reading it, that my mother had found a frame in which her lawsuit was an act of love and that she likely believed it, at least in the parts of herself she let herself examine. That was somehow worse than if she'd been simply cruel. The main evidentiary hearing ran 3 days. On the first, I took the stand. Diane walked me through my service history in broad, unclassified strokes. Commissioning, initial assignments, the promotion boards I'd made on schedule. I produced a redacted DD Form 214 excerpt and a limited personnel summary that confirmed my current rank and duty status without a single operational detail attached. It was real. It was also, deliberately, thin, because the Army had built it to be exactly thin enough to be true and no thinner. Holloway rose for cross with the unhurried confidence of a man who thought he already knew how this would end. "Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, if I may use the title, can you tell the court when you were promoted to your current rank?" 19. "And you can produce no ceremony, no photograph, no promotion order accessible to this court?" "Not one I'm authorized to disclose in full, no." "Can you tell this court the name of a commanding officer who could confirm, under oath, the operational basis for your accelerated promotion?" I paused. I thought about Whitfield, wherever he was, retired now, presumably somewhere quiet, presumably owing me nothing at all in the way of public testimony. "No," I said, "not today." "So, to summarize for the record, you're asking this court to accept your word, with no documentary corroboration and no available witness, for a fact that happens to determine the disposition of a very large sum of money." I'm not asking this court to accept anything, I said. I'm telling this court the truth. Whether the court finds a way to verify it within the limits of what I'm legally permitted to share, that's not something I control. Then why are you here at all, Colonel? Instead of simply requesting the Army verification your own counsel mentioned exists. I looked at him for a moment before I answered, and I found, to my own surprise, that my voice didn't shake. Because I earned the thing you're suggesting I invented. And if protecting it means I lose a portion of an inheritance, I'd rather lose the money than break an oath I made to 11 people I will not name in this room. Holloway wasn't finished. He picked up a folder, more for effect than information. I could tell by the way he barely glanced at it. Isn't it true, Colonel, that you could request that limited verification from the Army Board for correction of military records at any time and choose, deliberately, not to? That's true. And isn't it also true that the only person who benefits from that choice in this proceeding is you? No, I said. The people who benefit are 11 service members whose names have never appeared in a single public document connected to what happened to us, and who are entitled to stay that way whether or not it costs me a share of an inheritance. I don't get to spend their privacy to make my own case easier. That's not a legal argument, counselor. It's the only one I have. For the first time in 3 days, Holloway didn't have an immediate follow-up. He glanced at the jury box that wasn't there, an old habit, Diane told me later, from a man who usually tried cases in front of one and sat down instead. The gallery went quiet in a way I hadn't expected from a probate hearing. Judge Harmon, who had been making notes without looking up for most of the exchange, glanced up at that. Holloway recovered smoothly. No further questions. Diane didn't object to anything I'd said. She didn't need to. She caught my eye across the table for half a second and I understood the look. That's the line. That's the one they'll remember. My father testified on the second day with the particular calm of a man who has never once had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. I taught my children that real strength doesn't need an audience, he said. Vivian always wanted the audience. The uniform, the mystery. I think, if I'm honest with this court, it's always been about being seen. He didn't look at me when he said it. I noticed that. I don't know if he noticed it himself. My mother's testimony was more careful, more lawyerly, which made it land harder. I'm not questioning my daughter's service, she said. I'm asking this court to apply the same standard of proof it would apply to anyone else petitioning for a share of an estate this size. If the roles were reversed, if it were Preston making an unverifiable claim, I believe Vivian would ask the same question I'm asking now. Ugh, it was, infuriatingly, an intelligent thing to say, and I watched 2 members of the gallery nod along with it. I sat with my hands flat on the table in front of me, the way Diane had coached me to, and I thought about all the times over the years I had wanted badly to hand my mother some piece of the truth just to watch her face change. I had never once done it. Even now, listening to her frame a lawsuit as diligence, I found I still didn't want to. Some doors, once you understand what's actually behind them, you keep closed not for your own protection anymore, but for the people who'd be standing in the blast radius if they ever swung open. Preston's turn was shorter and worse. I don't think Vivian's a bad person, he said. I think she's spent so long being the family's mystery that she doesn't know how to just be a person who answers a question directly anymore. That's not an accusation. That's what it looks like from where I sit. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 breath, not because it hurt, though it did. Because I needed to keep it somewhere it wouldn't leak out onto the record. Diane leaned toward me during the recess that followed. They're going all in on character, she murmured. Facts second. It's a strategy and it's not a bad one. Let them, I said. There's nothing under the character they're describing that I'm ashamed of. On redirect, Diane asked Preston one question she hadn't previewed for me. Mr. Ashworth, is it true that the trust management office you run reported a loss on discretionary investments last fiscal year in excess of $200,000? Preston's pen stopped moving. That figure isn't part of this proceeding. I'll rephrase. Is it accurate? Holloway objected on relevance. Judge Harmon allowed it, narrowly, given the petition's own emphasis on financial competency, as a live issue in this hearing. Preston sat with that for a long moment before answering. It's accurate, he said quietly. No further questions, Diane said, and sat down without another word, letting the number sit in the room the way she let my own answer sit 2 days earlier. The night before closing arguments, I sat alone in a rented apartment near the courthouse, my service jacket draped over the back of a chair, an envelope I hadn't opened in 6 years sitting on the table in front of me. Whitfield had written it the week after Molly from the hospital, and mailed it to an address he'd had to get from someone 3 ranks removed from him because I'd moved twice since we'd served together and neither of us had ever quite gotten around to exchanging personal contact information the normal way. I'd never opened it. I told myself for years it was because reading it would make the whole thing feel finished, and I wasn't ready for it to be finished. The truer reason, I think, was that I was afraid of what a man like Whitfield, a man who did not waste words, might have found necessary enough to write down. I opened it that night. Vivian, you'll get this whenever you get it, whenever you're ready, which is entirely your business and not mine. I wanted it written while it was still true in my body, not just my memory. You made a decision under fire that most officers twice your rank never get tested on. You didn't ask permission because there was no one left to ask, and you didn't hesitate because hesitating wasn't in you that day. I have written exactly 5 commendation letters in 30 years of service using the phrase exceptional under fire. Yours will be the 6th whenever the Army lets me file it. I don't know what your life looks like from the outside. I imagine it looks quieter than what actually happened to you. That's the job. But I wanted one person outside the classified file to have said it to you plainly. What you did was not ordinary, and I will say so, on the record, the day I'm ever allowed to. M. Mir, Whitfield. I read it 3 times. Then I called a number I hadn't dialed in 6 years, not knowing if it would still connect. It rang twice. Whitfield. Sir. It's Vivian Ashworth. There was a pause on the line, not confused, just recalibrating, the way my father's face had recalibrated years ago, except this recalibration felt entirely different. Colonel Ashworth, he said, and I could hear something in his voice settle into place. I wondered when I'd hear from you. I told him everything. The will, the petition, the conservatorship request, all of it. He listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of answer. I can't discuss Molly in open court, he finally said, not the operational details. That door doesn't open for a probate case, and I wouldn't open it if it did. I know. But I can request expedited review from the classification office for a limited statement. Confirmation of your rank, confirmation that I recommended your promotion, confirmation of the general fact of distinguished conduct under my command, without a single tactical detail attached. I can ask for that tonight. It usually takes weeks. It might, given the circumstances, take a day. You do that, Colonel, he said, and I could hear even over the phone something that might have been the beginning of a smile. I've been waiting 8 years for a legitimate reason to say this in front of people who need to hear it. Get some sleep. Tell your attorney to expect a call. The courthouse steps smelled like wet asphalt when I walked up them the next morning in my dress uniform, past 2 reporters who'd finally caught wind that this was more than a routine estate dispute. I didn't stop. I didn't need to, not yet. Inside, my parents looked composed in the specific way people look composed when they believe the outcome is already decided. Preston twirled the pen between 2 fingers, the same nervous habit he'd had since he was 12. Judge Harmon took the bench and glanced toward the respondent's table. Before we proceed to closing arguments, counsel, anything further? Diane stood. Yes, Your Honor. The respondent has one additional witness whose availability was confirmed less than 18 hours ago, pending an expedited security review. We'd ask the court's indulgence to admit him. Holloway was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, the witness list closed 2 weeks ago. He wasn't available 2 weeks ago, Diane said evenly. He is now. I'm prepared to show good cause under the rules of civil procedure, and I'd note that petitioner's counsel is welcome to voir dire the witness on the scope and limits of his testimony before he's sworn. Judge Harmon considered this for a moment, glasses low on her nose. I'll allow a proffer, counsel, but I want to be precise about scope before this witness is sworn. If any classified matter is implicated, I expect both sides to raise it immediately, and I will not hesitate to strike testimony after the fact if necessary. Is that understood? Understood, Your Honor, Diane said. Holloway, visibly recalculating, requested a brief voir dire before the witness was sworn, a chance to question the general's authority to testify at all before he ever reached the stand. Judge Harmon allowed it. General, Holloway began. Careful now. Who authorized your appearance here today? The Department of the Army's Pre-Publication and Classification Review Office, following an expedited request submitted last night, Whitfield said. I have a written authorization letter for the court's file, which specifies precisely what I am and am not permitted to discuss, and if this court or counsel asks something outside that authorization, then I decline to answer, and I'd ask the court's understanding that the decline is not evasion, it's the law. Holloway had nothing further. Judge Harmon nodded to the bailiff. Call your witness. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Brigadier General Marcus Whitfield walked in wearing dress greens, a single silver star on each shoulder, a chest of ribbons that made two members of the gallery visibly straighten in their seats. He didn't rush, he didn't perform. He simply walked the length of the room the way a man walks, when he's spent 30 years learning that presence doesn't require volume. He stopped at the witness stand, was sworn, and sat. General, Diane began, can you state your relationship to the respondent? I commanded a joint task force element that then Major Vivian Ashworth was attached to in 2018. Are you able to discuss the operational details of that assignment? No. That information remains classified, and I've been authorized to testify only within a narrow scope approved last night by the Department of the Army's Classification Review Office. He turned slightly toward Holloway. Counsel, I'd ask that any question straying outside that scope be understood in advance as one I'm not able to answer, regardless of how it's phrased. Holloway, to his credit, nodded once, chastened. Diane continued, within that scope, General, can you confirm Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's rank and date of commission to that grade? I can! And I'll go one step further, because it's within the scope I was granted, and because it's overdue. He turned toward me for the first time. In the course of that assignment, then Major Ashworth assumed command under circumstances I'm not able to describe in detail, in a manner I would characterize, in my professional judgment, as exceptional under fire. I sustained an injury during that engagement. I am alive today because of decisions she made in approximately 90 seconds, without orders, without a clear chain of command, and without any expectation that anyone would ever be permitted to say so publicly. Gasps moved through the gallery like wind through dry grass. I recommended her for accelerated promotion, Whitfield continued, not as a courtesy, as a professional necessity. In 31 years of service, I have used the phrase exceptional under fire in a commendation exactly 6 times. Hers was the 6th. He rose from the witness stand, walked the short distance to where I sat, and in full view of the judge, the gallery, and the family that had spent months arguing I might not exist the way I claimed, came to attention and saluted. Colonel Ashworth, he said, it's an honor. My throat closed. I stood because some things your body does before your mind agrees to them, and I returned the salute. Thank you, sir. Judge Harmon let the silence sit for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was gentler than it had been all week. The court will take a short recess before closing arguments. She paused, glasses in hand now. General, before you're excused, thank you for your service and for your candor within its limits. During the recess, I found Whitfield alone in the hallway outside the courtroom, still in dress greens, looking somehow smaller now that the room he'd commanded a moment ago was empty around him. Sir, I said. Thank you doesn't cover it. It doesn't need to, he said. I've been sitting on that commendation letter for 6 years, like an old man hoarding a good bottle of something, waiting for the right occasion. I'll admit, a probate hearing in Pennsylvania was not the occasion I pictured. Neither did I. He studied me for a moment, the way commanding officers do when they're deciding whether a subordinate needs an order or just needs a minute. Your family, he said carefully, doesn't know what they almost cost themselves today. Not the money, the other thing. I know. Do you forgive them for it? I thought about that longer than I expected to. I'm working on understanding them, I finally said. I think forgiveness might come after that if it comes at all. I'm not going to force the order. Whitfield nodded, satisfied with the honesty of that answer in a way he wouldn't have been satisfied with a tidier one. That's about the most senior officer thing you've said all week, he said, and there was something almost fond in it. Good. Hold on to that instinct. It'll serve you longer than the rank will. What none of us expected, what even Diane hadn't seen coming, arrived in the final hour when Walter Ashworth's personal attorney, a quiet man named Elias Furman, who had drafted the original will and had been sitting unnoticed in the gallery for 3 days, asked to be heard on a narrow procedural matter. Your Honor, I represented Walter Ashworth privately, separately from the family's current counsel for 11 years before his death. I have a letter, executed alongside the will and intended for use only if the will's condition became the subject of formal dispute. Mr. Ashworth anticipated this possibility. He asked that I hold it in escrow. Holloway objected. Judge Harmon overruled him, citing the letter's clear testamentary purpose, and allowed it read into the record. Furman read it aloud, and the room went still in a different way than it had for Whitfield, quieter, older, sadder. To whoever is reading this in a courtroom, which means the thing I hoped wouldn't happen has happened anyway. I want to be honest about something I never told my son or my daughter-in-law. I've known for years that Vivian's service included something she was not free to discuss. I have old friends, men I served alongside in a different war, who still hear things through channels that don't officially exist. I never asked her about it directly because I understood, better than most people in this family ever will, what it costs to carry a silence like that. I wrote the trust condition the way I wrote it, a confirmed senior officer rank, not a publicly documented one, on purpose. I built in room for the Army to confirm what it could confirm through proper channels, without asking my granddaughter to break a promise to get her inheritance. If this letter is being read in a courtroom, it means someone in this family mistook a shield for a puzzle and tried to make her solve it in public. I am not angry. I loved all of you. But I built this condition to protect Vivian, not to test her. And I would ask this court, and my family, to remember that difference before deciding how this ends. Nobody in the gallery said anything for a long moment. My mother's hand had gone to her mouth. My father was looking down at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. Preston had stopped twirling the pen. Judge Harmon set the letter down carefully. Given the testimony of General Whitfield confirming the respondent's rank and conduct within the limits of proper authorization, and given the clear intent expressed in Mr. Ashworth's contemporaneous letter regarding the meaning of the trust condition, this court finds the condition satisfied. The petition to strike the respondent's share is denied. The request for conservatorship is denied in full, and frankly, given the record before me, I want to note for the file that I find no evidentiary basis for it beyond speculation. Petitioners will bear their own costs. The gavel came down once, and it was over. I looked at my father as the words landed. He wasn't looking at Holloway or at the judge or even at me. He was looking at the letter still resting on Furman's table at his own father's handwriting as if he were only now at 62 years old, meeting the man who'd raised him for the first time. Something in his face I hadn't seen since I was a child, not since the morning I told him I wasn't going to Wharton, came loose and didn't quite know where to go. My mother reached over and took his hand. Neither of them looked at me. I understood, watching them, that whatever came next between us would have to begin with them grieving a father and grandfather they'd apparently understood less than they believed before it could begin with them understanding me any better either. Reporters had gathered by the time we came down the steps, more of them now, because word travels fast when a general salutes someone in open court. One called out a question about whether I intended to sue my family for defamation in return. I stopped, just for a moment, long enough to answer that one directly, because I didn't want it hanging in the air unanswered. No, I said. I didn't spend 14 years learning restraint just to abandon it the first time I finally had the upper hand. Diane asked if I wanted to make a longer statement, and I shook my head. The truth had already spoken for me, twice in the space of one afternoon. Once in a general's voice and once in my grandfather's handwriting, read aloud by a man none of us had ever met before that morning. There wasn't anything I could add to that without cheapening it. My mother reached me first on the sidewalk, moving carefully in low heels she wasn't used to wearing to court 3 days in a row. Vivian, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. We didn't know about the letter, about the any of it. You didn't ask, I said. There's a difference between not knowing and not wanting to know badly enough to sit with the discomfort of the question. Her lips pressed together, the old courtroom habit, the one she used when she didn't have a ruling ready. I still don't understand why you couldn't have just told us. Because some of it isn't mine to tell, I said, and because the parts that were mine to tell, you stopped being willing to hear a long time ago. You sent me a 2-line email after 5 years of silence, Mom. I built an entire life you decided not to be curious about, and then you sued me because the life I built without you didn't come with enough paperwork for your comfort. My father stood a step behind her, arms crossed, expression unreadable in the particular way he perfected over 60 years. "This could have stayed private," he finally said. "You made it a lawsuit," I said. "I made it a defense. Those aren't the same choice, and I'd ask you not to confuse them." Preston hung back on the sidewalk, hands jammed in his pockets, not meeting my eyes. I walked over to him instead of waiting for him to come to me. "I know about the trust losses," I said quietly, just for him. "I've known since the second day of the hearing, when you mentioned the wrong quarter under cross-examination. You don't have to keep pretending this was about principle." His jaw tightened. "Ugh, it wasn't only about the money." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it, mostly. "I think it started as jealousy and turned into fear, and only became about the money once the fear needed somewhere to live. That doesn't make it okay. But I'm not interested in destroying you over it, Preston. I never was." He looked up at me then, actually looked for maybe the first time in a decade. "I'll release a portion of my share to cover what you owe," I said, "not as a gift. As a loan, at a real interest rate with a real repayment schedule drawn up by Diane, not by anyone in this family who's used a will as a weapon before. And you're going to tell Mom and Dad the truth about the investment losses yourself this week without me in the room to soften it for you." "Why would you do that?" "Because Grandpa built that condition to protect someone in this family from a fight like this one," I said. "I don't think he'd want the money to become the reason we finish tearing each other apart either." Preston didn't say thank you. He wasn't ready for that yet, and I didn't need him to be. He just nodded, once, the way people do when they're too full to speak, and I let that be enough for the day. My mother made one more attempt as I turned to leave. "We're still family, Vivian." I looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the way you look at someone when you finally stopped hoping they'll become a different person. "I didn't lose a family today," I said. "I stopped pretending I needed one to prove I was worth something. Those aren't the same loss, Mom. One of them actually hurts." Then I walked away, down the sidewalk, into late afternoon light that caught the silver oak leaf on my collar and made it, for the first time in a long time, feel like it belonged exactly where it was. A letter arrived with no return address, the handwriting unmistakable even before I opened it. The same economical, slanted script from 6 years earlier. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen. Me, mid-laugh, dust on my face, kneeling beside a young private during a supply run in a place I'm still not allowed to name. On the back, 4 words. "She never needed noise." No signature. He'd never needed one. I was promoted to full colonel 11 weeks after the hearing. The recommendation this time built on a record that could finally, partially, breathe in daylight. Whitfield came to the small ceremony along with Diane, and to my genuine surprise, Preston, standing awkwardly at the back in a suit that didn't quite fit, having flown out on his own initiative and his own dime. "You didn't have to come," I told him afterward. "I wanted to see the Eagles before they put stars on you instead," he said. And it was such an unexpectedly decent joke that I actually laughed, the first real laugh I'd had with him in years. I accepted a semester teaching appointment at the Officer Training Academy that fall. Not tactics, not weapons, but a course simply titled Operational Judgment, Command, Restraint, and Honor Under Constraint. My first class had 20 cadets in it, all younger than I'd been the day I carried a colonel 200 meters on a fractured leg that wasn't mine. They looked at me like I was carved out of something, impressive and slightly untouchable, the way young people look at rank before they understand what actually sits underneath it. I opened with a question instead of a lecture. "What do you do," I asked, "when the people who are supposed to know you best decide they don't believe what you've become?" Nobody answered right away. A cadet in the second row finally raised a hand. "Prove them wrong, ma'am?" "That's the instinct," I said. "It's not always the right one. Proving someone wrong requires them to be paying attention in good faith. Sometimes the people closest to you aren't. Sometimes the only person you can actually prove anything to is yourself, and you have to decide whether that's going to be enough on the days when nobody else claps." Another cadet, quieter, near the back. "Isn't that lonely, ma'am?" "Yes," I said, and I didn't dress it up for them, because I'd promised myself years ago I wouldn't lie to young officers about the cost of the job just to make it sound more romantic than it is. It's lonely. It's also the only version of the job that's actually honest. You don't get to choose both total visibility and total integrity. Sometimes you get one or the other, and you have to decide, ahead of time, which one you're willing to live without. So I told them a version of the story. Not the names, not the classified pieces, but the true shape of it, that leadership sometimes means standing silent while a lie gets louder than you're allowed to. That rank isn't a decoration. It's a weight you agree to carry whether or not anyone ever sees you carrying it. After class, a small cadet with sharp, watchful eyes lingered by the door, hands twisting the strap of her bag. "Ma'am," she said. "Cadet Reyes, Naomi." She hesitated. "My brother tells everyone I'm wasting 4 years here. Says I'll never be the kind of officer people actually listen to." I looked at her, really looked, and saw, with an ache that surprised me, a version of myself standing in a garage at 2 in the morning packing a duffel bag nobody had offered to help her carry. I reached into my jacket and took out my grandfather's field watch, the one I'd worn on every deployment since he'd given it to me, scratched glass and all, and held it out to her. "This kept time in places that didn't care what time it was," I said. "It'll keep time for you too." She took it like it might anchor her to the floor. "I don't know if I can live up to that." "You don't have to live up to it," I said. "You just have to command yourself first. The rest follows, slower than you'd like, but it follows." That night I walked out to the small memorial wall behind the Academy Chapel, tucked between 2 rows of old pines. No press, no ceremony, just names carved into granite that had earned their silence honestly. I traced a few I recognized, left a small bundle of flowers under one I didn't, and stood there as the light went orange and then gray over the hills. I thought about my grandfather's letter, read out loud in a courtroom by a man I'd never met, defending a granddaughter he'd understood better in death than my own parents had managed in life. I thought about Whitfield's 6 commendations and the 6 years it took me to open one of them. I thought about Preston's suit that didn't fit, and the loan payments that would start arriving, slow and real, in the mail. My mother had called twice since the ceremony. I hadn't answered either time, not out of cruelty, but because I didn't yet trust myself to have the conversation she wanted without either shutting the door too hard or opening it too wide. Diane had told me once early in the case that some relationships don't get resolved by a verdict. They just get a clearer set of facts to work with afterward, and the actual repair happens later, slower. Off the record if it happens at all. I thought she was probably right. I thought, too, that I finally had the patience to find out, now that I wasn't spending all of it defending the right to exist in the first place. I thought about Naomi Reyes walking back to her dormitory with my grandfather's watch on her wrist, carrying a weight she hadn't asked for and would spend years learning to hold the way I'd learned to hold mine. Badly at first, then less badly then, if she was lucky, and stubborn in equal measure. Well enough that it stopped feeling like a weight at all and started feeling like a shape she'd grown into. They had tried, for a season, to make me prove I was real in a language built for people who never had to disappear to serve. I hadn't needed the courtroom to know who I was. But I understood standing there that I had needed it anyway, not to prove anything to a judge, but to finally say out loud in front of the people who doubted me longest, that the silence I'd carried all those years hadn't been absence. It had been discipline, and discipline, when it finally speaks, doesn't need to raise its voice. The wind moved through the pines, not sharp, not cold, just honest. I took out my phone, looked at my mother's 2 missed calls for a long moment, and finally typed a short message instead of calling back. Not an olive branch exactly, not yet, but the first sentence of one. "Dinner next time I'm in town, just us, no lawyers." I didn't wait for a reply. I wasn't ready for whatever it would say, and I'd learned, the hard way, that some doors are better left open a crack than forced shut or thrown wide before you're steady enough to stand in the frame. I stood there a while longer before I turned and walked back toward the lit windows of the academy, toward 20 cadets who would show up again tomorrow, toward a life I no longer had to explain to anyone who hadn't earned the right to ask. I thought walking back about the version of myself who had packed a duffel bag alone in a garage at 19. Certain that the only way forward was to become unreachable enough that no one could hurt her by not understanding her. That version of me had been right about almost everything except the ending. Unreachable had kept me safe. It had also, for a long time, kept me alone in rooms where I didn't have to be. I didn't regret the silence. I would make most of the same choices again, oath for oath, mission for mission, if the years rewound and asked me to. But I let myself imagine walking under those pines with the last of the light going, that the next chapter might not require quite so much of it, that there might be a version of my life finally, where the people who loved me got to know a little more of the truth than the version who'd raised me had ever been offered the chance to earn. Some silences, it turns out, aren't the sound of something missing. They're the sound of something being kept, carefully, on purpose, until the day it's finally safe enough to set back down.